Hello and welcome to the DocArena Podcast in association with Film Ireland. My name is Ross Whitaker, and in this podcast series I talk to filmmakers about their documentaries, both in terms of the subjects they choose and the way in which they fund, craft and distribute their work. In this episode, I speak to Emmy-winning directors Peter Mortimer and Nick Rosen, two of the team behind the 4-part documentary series Dark Wizard. An up-close and unflinching look at the jaw-dropping feats and personal turmoil that define the life of record-breaking climber, base jumper and highline walker Dean Potter. This extraordinary series left me both fascinated by Potter's inner life and completely stunned by the incredible footage from the rock faces of Yosemite and beyond. Calling Potter larger than life would be an understatement, and the series is simply unmissable. For Mortimer and Rosen, who also recently made The Alpinist, it's another major work in the world of adventure sports. Here's a clip from the trailer.
When I was a little boy, my first memory was this dream of falling.
Dean Potter.
Climber, artist, outlaw.
Keep quiet. He was pioneering this entirely new way of climbing big walls, totally solo.
Dean would say, no one's gonna control my life. I'm gonna do things my way.
We're gonna jump this ding 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 dong.
Turn off the camera.
No, I think you're harassing me. They're not going to catch me.
He was the most badass motherfucker in the valley.
He did things that will never be repeated.
I've hurt my head.
And shouldn't be repeated.
You ready, sweetie pie? I don't think I'm a very good role model for children.
Growing up, he was my climbing hero, but I am now directly competing with Dean, encroaching on his turf.
Alex Honnold had these same ambitions and he had these same goals.
You're gonna have conflict going on.
I'm doing pretty good.
With all respect to Dean.
He knew that was my project, and he did it before me because he's a competitive twerp.
Dean's feeding off that energy to push himself to the brink.
Thank you for joining me. Pleasure to meet you. I absolutely loved the series, which I'm sure you're hearing everywhere.
Wow.
So
Awesome. Thank you. It means a lot.
Welcome. Yeah, welcome.
That's all we want to hear.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think, you know, for a community of people who don't know the story, maybe it's completely exceptional to go through this 4 hours. It's extraordinary. So, you know, I've just spent the last day texting everyone I know about it. So you're going to get a few new subscribers on HBO Max, I imagine.
Awesome.
I'm curious, Ross, did HBO just land in Ireland the same way it landed in the UK, or is that okay? Cool.
Exactly that. So it's just been here for a few weeks. So it's incredible timing for them that this series is landing now, because a lot of people will be curious about it for sure. As I said, a lot of people wouldn't know the story. So maybe as a first question, if one of you wouldn't mind, for the uninitiated, can you tell me a little about Dean Potter and this series, what it is?
Nick, you wanna start?
Sure, yeah. So Dean Potter was a legendary figure in the world of climbing in the 90s and the 2000s. For a good decade, he was kind of stood at the pinnacle of kind of adventurous form of climbing that took place largely, you know, the sort of epicenter of which was Yosemite Valley, climbing these big walls. Also, he sort of, broadened his ambit and his disciplines into these other things like walking highlines stretched across these chasms and jumping off cliffs with a parachute and eventually flying a wingsuit like a flying squirrel through these cliffs, and even combining these disciplines in this really creative way that distinguished Dean, I think, almost as a creative force, almost as like at least a self-identified artist and performance artist within the world of climbing, which was incredibly unique and really made him stand out. And especially in the climbing world, but even somewhat beyond, created this real mystique around Dean, his moniker, the Dark Wizard, which kind of encapsulates this sort of, kind of mystical side, a sort of dark tinged side to his personality that people were only sort of vaguely aware of, but it kind of was really, part of this persona that was almost, he put a lot of effort into constructing this persona. And I guess, through the years, Pete and I worked with Dean for a few years, and we also helped to create that persona by documenting his feats. And he really was an incredible individual, both in terms of the sport, but also everything around it. Then, spoiler alert, he passed away in 2015. But I think, 10 years later, Pete and I were really intending to revisit the life of Dean Potter and look through it, both to recount some of these amazing events and even celebrate some of that kind of that myth that surrounded Dean, but at the same time, really go deeper. Look into a very sort of personal, sometimes quite dark, and more complex story than the general public and the climbing world was aware of, and try to understand Dean as a person, and with all his vulnerabilities and failings, but also beauty and strength.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is he was the leader of this group of climbers and adventurists that they kind of called themselves the Stone Monkeys. And he was, just this incredible alpha sort of silverback character who, he was 6'5", like beautiful, this incredible physique. And I think for the people around Dean, he almost was a cult-like figure. He almost had like a following, and he would get these big visionary ideas, and he'd rope all of his friends into it and film, and everyone was filming, and everyone was helping set rigging and set stuff up. And so a big part of the documentary is the interviews with people. Again, 10 years after Dean passed, just like he was almost the most important person in all these people's lives. And they all had super complex, messy, traumatic, up and down relationships with Dean. Nick and I had that as well. I think less so. I personally had more of a professional relationship with him. So I think just like the emotional intensity of, and the untangling and the revisiting of his story is such a big part of the documentary as well.
There's so much in this series. It's such a deep telling of a story. It's novelistic. It's, so confidently made. I'd love to know a little bit more about you guys, your filmmaking background that brought you to this point, that I suppose that made you feel you were the right ones to tell this story, both in terms of the sport itself, but also this very kind of nuanced character.
Yeah. We met Dean in like 2006. So he was already sort of had risen onto the scene as this new force. And, I grew up, I'm still in Boulder, Colorado, which is like one of the climbing capitals of the United States. So I'd been really immersed in climbing. I got into it in middle school, and they just like always loved the climbing culture. And when I started making films later, I gravitated towards climbing. And so, we've made a few feature films and a lot of short films and documentaries within this world of climbing and mountaineering and adventure. And we're always looking at the characters, and like we're always asking, like, for us, it's always like, why? Because these people are doing incredible things. And like, as climbers, we're like, okay, we love the sport, but we're not doing that. Like, and it's always so unique and personal for each person. And, so Dean was just, we had a 10-year relationship with him, and a lot of it was being a part of these, helping film and tell his story. I also climbed with him a bunch and had some incredible climbing adventures with him. And, he would come through Boulder and sleep in my basement and, talk about yoga with my wife. And he was really into like, so we had this personal relationship, not nearly as deep as as many of the people in the film who like went like super, super deep with Dean and got, spent like months and years with him. And so when he passed away, we made a little tribute video to him, just with some of his incredible footage. And then, we knew we wanted to tell a story, and we always just felt like we were the people to tell the story. I mean, there's a few other people along with us who are like the big storytellers in this adventure world. But we just felt like we knew Dean. We knew Dean's story needed to be told, and we felt like we were the ones to tell it. And so it was about 5 years after he passed away, I reignited a conversation with his sister Elizabeth, who's in the series, and she had sort of taken over the family, like all of Dean's, sort of estate for the family. And we started talking, and I was like, I want to tell this. And she's a writer as well, and a really deep thinker. And, we basically had like a 2-year conversation, and I was like, I want to tell the story. We don't want to just like mythologize Dean. We don't want to do what was done during his life, because there's a lot of films out there of like, just like Dean pulling off these incredible stunts and everyone cheering. And she totally got it. At one point I was like, all right, I want to call it The Dark Wizard. And she was like, what? And then she said she like went on a walk with her nephew, I think it was with her nephew, who had like known Dean, and he was like, that's Dean, like that's totally Dean, that captures him. And she's like, okay, that took me a second to get there, but I get it. And so we pitched the series, and just because the underlying footage was so incredible, I think there's a lot of interest in it right away. And we knew it needed to be a series, not a film, just because of how deep we were starting to see some of the big scenes. And we're like, this is not in a film, you got to compress all your big scenes. And we're like, you need, like, the thing with Dean is like, it's like, to really understand what he pulled off, there's like the vision. He's like got the vision, and it's crazy. It's beautiful. And then there's like the mental process that he goes through, and the tension building, and the stress, and the just like the fear building inside him as he's recognizing what he's doing. And then the fear of just like the tension with everybody around it. And then the actual event, like he does this thing, and then you would just, the transformation in Dean afterwards, as he said, it's like, it just feels so good to be alive. He's almost floating on it. So we knew these needed to be bigger scenes, more immersive, and it needed to be a series. And so we pitched it, I think it was almost 3 years ago. So then we've just spent the last 3 years, shooting the interviews and in post-production, putting this story together.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I wonder a little bit about the series versus the feature. You seem to know that quite clearly. That's what you wanted to do. Two things struck me was, you needed 4 episodes because you're telling this huge life story from beginning to end. So, it would be a shame to compress that into one feature. But at the same time, the other aspect that struck me was like how Dean thinks of him as an artist, and how that informed what you did as filmmakers. Because I feel like you spoke to that artistry in how you made it, and you gave it that space. And I actually haven't seen your other films, but I'm not sure, was it different from previous work in that way, and that you spoke to who he was through those sequences? And I felt like you really leaned into that artistry. And was that something that you had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I think I'm not sure even if it sort of was part of our founding vision for this, but as you delve into Dean's life, for instance, when you look at his personal journals, and we, had decided early on that we were going to sort of rely on that as a pillar of our storytelling, because it was such an intimate and revealing window into Dean's psyche. Even within those journals, Dean was creating art, and that art was filled with the emotion of everything that he was going through, as well as his kind of creative flourishes. And so that became sort of a component, that was artistic. But also, when you're really trying to confront Dean's story, you get drawn into all of these kind of like, passageways that if you're a sort of like grounded materialist person, you might not have thought you were going to buy into. I didn't totally wasn't sure sort of what I thought of what it meant to be like an artist climber, or like all of Dean's really kind of almost supernatural beliefs, and his, his profound connection to the dreams he had and the dream world that he had. We were forced to confront those dreams and illustrate them artistically. And so I'm not sure if this is kind of where you're going with the question, but I do think that Dean's commitment to the idea of art, his self-conception as an artist, and his very deeply emotional, unfiltered emotional, and almost kind of, supernatural way of viewing the world, infused itself and posed itself on our storytelling. And yeah,
it's definitely there, and I'm sure you work closely with your editor in that respect as well. But I was watching, when I was going through the fourth episode, I was thinking to myself, this could have been told completely differently. You could see in different hands, you could see someone, trying to compress elements of this that would take away so much of the feeling that it creates. And I just thought that was beautiful. And as you say, if you were trying to do that in a feature framework, you'd be forced to do that. You wouldn't have that space. So, I really felt like maybe, as you say, it just happens naturally when you're dealing with a story like this, but it was very much there. And it sounds like you went with that. You didn't try and fight against it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also like Dean's journey, you see the sort of the ending of his supremacy in episode 3, right? And sort of his battle of letting go, of recognizing that, he was no longer the king of this world, with, Alex Honnold coming in, and, Dean getting older. He was approaching 40. And I think that it's such a painful struggle in episode 3. And, it just has this natural unraveling that sort of, culminates in China. And then the after, like, I think he kind of hits his low at the end of China. And then after that, his journals talking about like needing to apologize, he started doing all these voice memos. And I think just because probably he got an iPhone or something at that point. And, it's almost like he's narrating his own story, and he's like, I'm not the spiritual guy I'm trying to be. Like, I've lost my path a little bit. And then his real intention to set a new path for himself, to find love, to find, to do something that was less than just about his, like, serving his vision. It was like, he moved on a little bit beyond his vision. And I think it makes it so tragic, when you see, his ego start coming back in a little bit, and you see the competitive side, which, at times had served him really well, at times had like sort of pushed him in all these different directions. And so I think that story arc through episodes 3 and 4 were just so natural to, to the structure of how we built that.
Can you talk a bit more about that in a more kind of like we have a lot of filmmakers that are interested in this, these podcasts and this website, and I'm just wondering from like a technical point of view how you work together, how you construct a narrative across 4 episodes with so much material. Do you have an approach to that? Like, do you have a kind of mechanism to help you put that together, or is it more trial and error as you go? Or
Man,
Yeah, I
every
mean, I'm gonna.
project is different, right? Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, Nick, you could. I just like. So we actually pitched this as 5 episodes. So Nick and I, we do a lot of like beat sheeting is kind of our. Once we kind of all right, we have all the material, we have the big scenes. We've done a few of the big interviews. We did those up top, and we're like, okay. And we pitched this as 5 episodes, and we ended up doing 4, which I think is great. And then we kind of were looking at each episode as a standalone film within the broader scope. So like we and this is something Nick really wanted to do, was like we held off on talking about flying until episode 2 to like introduce that and have episode 2 really is built around this idea of flying, and then episode 3 is really built around the competition with Alex Honnold, and episode 4, so the idea was like each one is a standalone film almost within this broader, but they all serve this story. It's really complex. But Nick, sorry,
No, yeah. I mean, it is complex. And Pete and I and our partner, Josh Lowell, who's also a really important part of our process, we approach each one of these projects and we make a lot of films like every year. And each one has its own challenge and its own kind of potential, you know what I mean? And with this one, we had 2 big elements, or a few big elements. There was sort of the archival element, which, of all the footage that had been shot with Dean, what we knew about, but also like what was left to be discovered, which it turns out was a lot of stuff. And as well as, his journals, these other materials. And then there were these interviews, and Pete and Josh and I have always kind of lived and died by our interviews. And it's a lot of these interviews were like 8 hours long, spanning maybe even 2 days long, spanning. We try to go really deep with those. And so, and we kind of build our story on the kind of spoken word, and the sort of testimony of his friends and the people that were close to him. But at the same time, like the archive had its own voice and its own sort of surprises and sort of treasures in store that kind of tended to sort of dictate the narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to let that have its own space and storytelling, I suppose, as well. I was working with some surfers some time ago, and somebody said to me, surfing is an art, but you need someone there to capture the art. And that's something that Dean was obviously very mindful of, and he filmed so much of his life. But for you guys taking on this story, you are, I suppose, the tellers of his story, for now and forever, probably, in a way. Did you feel a lot of responsibility in that?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, it's a huge responsibility and honor, and also burden. This is being able to tell Dean's story. I mean, yeah, it is like this really unique opportunity. There's no other story that's going to be exactly like this in the world. And he was a really, really singular person. And he's dead. He can't speak for himself. He can no longer tell his own story. So, we both needed to make our own judgments and really try to be honest, tell a story in the way that Dean probably would not tell it himself. But at the same time, do it in a way that was fair and honest and did justice to his legacy.
Yeah. And
Sorry, go
just to
ahead, Peter.
chime in on that, like, I think one of our driving things is like, there's so many biopics that are made now about famous people. And, whether it's Schwarzenegger or David Beckham or whatever it is. And, I think one thing that really bothers me as a documentary filmmaker is this idea that that the person being featured is authorizing this documentary, that this is the story that like they want to tell. And often like you watch these things and then you go read The Guardian and then they're like, oh, here's the actual story of what was happening then, but they didn't tell you that, but it's supposed to be like an expose. And so going into this, we knew Dean was just we knew there was so much more from knowing Dean than the mythology that people kind of knew about Dean. And sort of a lot of people, like even with the delicate art, people had different opinions about Dean. And so we went into this with like, everything needs to be on the table. And this is not the story that Dean, this is not the authorized biography. This is like the story, like it's almost the unauthorized story. And it's interesting because I think in doing that, people are always like, do you think Dean would like this? Like, how would he feel about this? And I think he would be like kind of horrified on some level that we had access to all this stuff and all his friends are saying these things, friends who like he had kind of not reconciled with or saying all these things about him. But on the flip side, I think Dean, who was always trying to get to something deeper, he said in the end, he's like, I was trying to transcend human limitations, trying to like not just go beyond like flying, but go beyond like ego. And sorry, it just got really loud right here. And so I think like that was a big driving force for us going into this, is like everything is on the table and this is going to feel, we want this to feel deeper and more raw and more real than sort of like what you're getting in a lot of the sort of authorized biographies of amazing people.
Yeah, big time. I mean, I have two more questions if we have time. So the penultimate one is, Dean put a lot of store in his dreams and, what his dreams said to him. I was just wondering if Dean has ever come to you guys in a dream in the making of this film and what he said to you, or if at any point that you felt like you had to feel like you were in conversation about him and what you were saying about him and with him.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think you can't sort of go as deep in a creative project like this without it invading your subconscious. And Dean has haunted my dreams on maybe more than one occasion. The dream that I had was that, we're 3/4 of the way through this project. We've got our story. This is all happening. It's going to go public. And then Dean rematerializes, shows up back on the scene, and is like ready to see a cut. and needless to say, it was terrifying. I probably woke up, sweating and perhaps relieved that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and I think like Nick and I have both had these experiences. Like we were friends with Dean and we love Dean, but we're also able to, really putting that aside in being filmmakers, and like we're the ones telling his story, and we're trying to look at his story, how to tell the story for people who knew Dean, for people who didn't know Dean, and so we can be in that filmmaker role. And then both of us have had these moments. Like I remember I had at one point in episode 4, I had put in just like this one little shot. It's not even in the final cut actually, but it was this one little shot of Dean shirtless drinking coffee. And and I was like, Nick, what do you think of this? And he just like completely broke down and started crying. And he's like, oh my God, I miss Dean. And like triggered something for him. And we both had those moments along the way where we've been like, and it's funny, I've had this film, we filmed a lot of this really scary stuff. I remember one time I was filming with Alex Honnold for a separate project, for a separate climb. And he was free soloing this thing. And it was so terrifying what he was doing. And I kind of like, I remember I like turned the camera and I was looking at him and I just like got this like, I was up above him and I got this sick feeling. And then I like put the camera in front of my lens and was like, okay, I'm a professional. I'm a cameraman. Like, this is my job. You know, I like removed, I was able to like go into filmmaker mode and remove the human element of it. And I got the shot, you know, and Alex was fine. And I think there was a lot of that in the last 3 years of making this with Dean, where you can, I mean, we're looking at this footage and we're going so deep. And Nick and I did like hours of interviews with Dean, and you're watching this stuff and you're getting emotional and you're getting sucked into it. And then you're like, okay, like, what's the story? We're the filmmakers. Like, how are we telling this story? What's the emotion? What's the human element of this? So I think that was a big part of the process for both of us.
Yeah, great. Like you do kind of fall back on your technique, don't you? Like this is your experience and what you've done over the years. And to that, I have one last quick question for you guys, which I ask a lot of people, which is what advice would you give your younger filmmaking self? You've got tons of experience now, many years of filmmaking. What's the one thing you wish you knew when you were in your 20s and starting out?
All right, I'll give Nick a second. It's just like the immediate thing that comes to me is like collaborating. Like, you gotta freaking collaborate. Like, I have a lot of good ideas. You know, we're all sort of have this artist in us, but like this project, which is, I think Nick and I both feel is like bigger and more complex and kind of more exciting than anything we've done. It is such a collaboration with, you know, not just me and Nick, but our partner, Josh Lowell, and then all these like graphic designers and all the people who were interviewed and, you know, friends of Dean who were chasing down footage. I mean, we have footage from like 100 different footage and photos from like 100 different sources, working with Dean's sister. Like the what you can do individually is so much smaller than what you can do as like part of a collaboration. And that's hard when you're starting out. I think you're like, I'm an artist, I got my vision, but like it can get bigger with collaboration.
Yeah, and I guess I would say it's just like keep working. I mean, I do think that like whether it's 10,000 hours or, you know, just our 20 years of working together, just the process and the iteration. And, you know, I don't think you ever sort of become an expert at this stuff because every project presents its own challenges and demands a certain sort of part of you and your collaborators. And but I do think like finding a way to just keep working. And if you're not being paid for it, find ways to do it for yourself because, you know, it's just a very difficult thing to do, I think, is making films. It requires so much, you know, kind of like stress and work, but that I just think that like the more you do it, kind of the stronger you become. And, you know, and yeah, I just think like keep going, make films, shoot films, make them, you know.
Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure talking to you. I absolutely adored the series. I think it's a phenomenal piece of work.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Keep telling your
Thank
friends.
you.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, and I hope everyone discovers it on HBO Max now that we can watch it here in Ireland. So yeah, congratulations and thanks for the interview.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks for the great questions. Yeah.
Thanks again to Pete and Nick for taking part in the interview. Their series Dark Wizard is widely available on HBO Max right now and worth a subscription if you don't already have access through Sky. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting the podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly allowing me to steal his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. And thanks to you for listening.